All right, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. We're not joined by Sam tonight. He's had other engagements, but we are, of course, joined by John Mackay and Dr. Diane Eager. We've got a rather interesting topic to go through tonight. I will be completely honest with you. I'm fairly exhausted. It's been a very it's been one of those days, as we say here in the UK. It's lots of stuff has happened, and not all of it brilliant. So I'm fairly fairly tired, and my back's bad. But we've got a really interesting topic for you tonight.
Joseph, why don't you be honest and say your car stopped suddenly, held up? Well, I won't give you any more details, but you're in reasonable shape for someone who's lived through it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's been the day has not been without its issues, to put it politely. But the Lord is good, and we're here, we're alive, which is excellent. And yeah, we keep praising Him, and problems will be sorted soon, Lord willing. Anyway, we've got a great topic tonight. It's a topic that I am getting increasingly more involved in academically, so that's got a big interest for me. It's a question we get asked a lot about on the chat. It's something we've dealt with lots and lots in the past. And John, I know that as you were sort of preparing some of this, you said there was so much information about this. It's really hard to kind of narrow it down to what we're going to talk about, because the topic tonight is radioactive dating, radiocarbon dating, carbon-14, all that kind of stuff.
Yes, all that sort of stuff, because like you, over all the years I've been involved in this, whether we've been on a uranium mine or whatever, people always go back to the familiar, the stuff that's in the Woman's Weekly or the Daily Press. What about carbon-14? The world is millions of years old. The average person out there thinks that carbon-14 and millions of years go hand in hand, and it's a blanket question. But it's an important one, because the very principles that are used in carbon-14 actually apply to just about everything. So we're going to have a fun night tonight, and it's going to be an informative and exciting night.
Indeed, yeah. Really looking forward to it. All right, few quick announcements before we dive into our ministry update. We've already had a comment. Got people in the chat already. That's great. No super chat tonight. No, unfortunately, there is no super chat tonight. We are still having troubles with monetization. Facebook has basically frozen our YouTube rather, sorry, has frozen our account. And so we are working on it. We are pretty sure there will be a solution very shortly. So just bear with us, but we do still need your support. So you will see in the description below there is a link to go and donate, either through PayPal or through our other secure website as well. Go and check that out. It's nice and easy. It's nice and quick. You can support in your local country. So we would really appreciate any support that you get, we get through that way, and any support that you can give would be amazing. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to start really with a bit of a ministry update and show you one or two rather interesting things that we've got coming up. We're finally almost all go with this thing. The Rocks Cry Out UK Fossil Convention. It's taking place from the 26th of September to the 1st of October. You can see Charmouth leading over towards Seatown and Golden Cap there in the background. You can see me holding one of the first swimming dinosaurs ever to be discovered. They're not technically dinosaurs, but most people call them that. The ichthyosaurs, the big sea dragons. Yes, you heard me correct. They used to be called sea dragons. You can go to the Natural History Museum in London and you can see the old Victorian specimens with the big, thick black ink labels on them, sea dragons. You can come on this convention, and we're not only basing it around fossil hunting, so we'll take you to 4 different locations during the week where you can come and dig up fossils and actually learn the truth about the rocks by getting hands-on. We also have got workshops. We're at a base camp in a beautiful campsite just down the road from these fossil locations called Monkton Wild. We're hiring out their entire rally field, and we're going to have a great big marquee which is going to be heated, and you'll get to come and camp and participate in the workshops. And in the evening we're also going to have some seminars, so 2 seminars an evening, 2 presentations an evening, with the likes of myself. John will be joining us virtually, Diane will be joining us virtually, as well as a number of other presenters from the UK. It promises to be a really, really cool an exciting and unique opportunity to actually come on a bit of a sort of a retreat convention, whatever you want to call it, get some good time of fellowship, get some good fossil hunting in there, and everything else as well. There's some of the details. It is up online now as well, and it'll be up fully on all of our websites very shortly, so you'll have all the details there. There is an early bird offer on, which you can get 20% off per person, so get your booking in now. You go to creationresearchstore.com, it's up on there, and Creation Research UK, it will shortly be up on those websites with all of the details and the handbooks and everything as well. You can see some of the stuff that you get to do: daily Bible devotions, daily overview sessions, fossil hunting workshops, seminars, and everything else. So go and check that out now. Well, other than that, like I say, it's been a fairly busy day and a very busy week for me, both with study and sorting this out and all the different things that have happened in the past 12 hours. But John, what's it been like over in Australia for you?
Okay, well, it's started to dry up here in Queensland. Really, we just shifted the rain further south, so they're now getting all our floods, and we're drying out nicely, and the grass is growing crazy, and the flowers and the orchids are looking beautiful. So that's at the natural level. At the ministry level, I was really encouraged yesterday when I got a comment from a child educator and a mum about this book. Now, sorry for those in the UK, because we've had COVID for a couple of years, we've sort of cut down on distributing books and things like that. But now the doors are opening up. Joseph, you're going to get the details of this and start printing it over there, aren't we, if we can make it work?
Absolutely,
it's called 2 Bites. It's part of our children's series, which are done sort of poetically, fun-wise, and serious-wise. This is on where sin comes from and how Jesus deals with it. I mean, it's beautifully illustrated. And the mum and the child educator said, this is the best book you've done for kids. You see, some are dealing with monkeys and some are dealing with dinosaurs, but this one's dealing with the problem of sin. Sin, snakes, Satan, serpents, Jesus' cross. You will love that book. And God willing, now that the barriers are just beginning to fall apart with COVID stuff, you'll get it over there in England too. Those of you in Australia, you can actually get it over here. So that's 2 Bites. You can order it from creationresearch.net. We're missing Sam because he can't plug up all of those things. Are you fast enough to do that, Joseph? Put up all the websites and all that.
Let's see how good I do. Let's see
how good you are, mate. Otherwise, we'll send a complaint to Sam about how low quality the replacement is there. Okay, so that's number one. Yeah. Number two, we've had quite a interesting week in ministry. So I'm going to bring up a screen here, and hopefully we'll get to share screen. There we are. Now, don't you like that? Last week we talked about Sam's new invention of a new logo, and so we took that, we've worked on it, and that's what's now appearing on our latest newsletter, which is at the printers right now. And of course, you'll start seeing it on our PowerPoints and everything like that. So even though Sam's not here tonight, give him a clap virtually, of course, or send him a thank you letter, put it online, how you really do like the new Creation Research logo. You can see the CR for Creation Research. You can see the dinosaur because Joe's into dinosaur. Can you see Adam there? Yep, the man beside the tree, the first Adam and the last Adam. Jesus died on a tree, and the scripture makes a whole lot about that. So the symbolism there is pretty good. So congratulations, Sam. We really do appreciate that. Okay, what else has been happening? Thank you, Tasmanian team. You see, in the last couple of weeks, our Tasmanian team has been looking forward to all the barriers coming down, and they've come down in Tasmania. From mainland Australia, we can visit. But they went out and they collected some more fossils. Great to have all these young blokes going out and digging up. Well, hey, Joe, I'm sure you would agree that that looks like a devil's toenail.
Mm.
You know, the old oyster shell that's all curved around and warped.
Gryphea, I believe, isn't it? Gryphea, the oysters.
Yeah, that's right. Looks like just a bent up oyster. So they've had a great time collecting fossils for the museum. In fact, even this one here, test you, Joe. What do you think that one is?
Little brachiopod, perhaps?
That's a beautiful brachiopod. And many of these are Permian fossils in the uplands of Tasmania. And combined with corals and all sorts of interesting shells all mixed together. So what the whole project is about, in our museum at Beauty Point, they're setting up a display of all the fossils of Tasmania, all the flood fossils, the ones where the shallow creatures are buried with the deep sea creatures. You see, we've got a display like this where in one deposit we found shells from 20 meters below the surface buried with diatoms that normally live 3,000 meters, 7,000 feet below the surface. Mixed deposits. Well, you can pray for our Tasmanian team. There's the bosses. There's Brendan and Diane on the right-hand side, and Craig and Rochelle on the left-hand side. And there's the old living fossil behind, still wearing his same hat. But we've got a great flood deposit and a great flood museum. And this new display will be a display of Tasmania's flood fossils. So pray for them, support the ministry overall through this program here. And I'd encourage you to remember that Joseph does some funny things sometimes. Not only did his car stop so suddenly today with a big load in the back, Joseph actually produced a brochure for his campsite. You know, the one coming up in September? This is the first one he wanted us to promote. The Rocks Cry Out. And I looked at that and I thought, I don't want any rocks crying out retreat. You know, it took ages to convince Joseph what was wrong with the English and the grammar there. But there's a funny side to creation research as well. But there's also a serious side. That will be a great retreat to actually go on, a great time of fossil collecting, as will this one down under. Now, because of the hour, it's early in the morning, we don't normally have too many people in Australia who get up and want to watch this program. But the folks in America, the folks in Europe, the folks in England, you are up. Tell your friends. Easter in the bush in Victoria. You can camp. You can bring your van. You can even visit it daily. You can be blessed by great Bible teaching by yours truly as we go from Good Friday all the way through to Easter Sunday. And we have some great times on a field trip on Saturday. It's full of fellowship. It's fun. There's room for 140 out in the bush. So yes, you will be accompanied by kookaburras and kangaroos and all sorts of things. And you can actually locate it. You've heard of Victoria, probably. Some of you may even know about Bendigo from our gold rush days. But 40 minutes west of Bendigo, what's there? Well, at Easter, it'll be me and 139 other people on a wonderful weekend. Now, this information came together yesterday and it'll be up on our website, hopefully by this afternoon. So all sorts of things to pray for and praise for. And again, send young Sam a congratulations for his great new logo. And Joseph, back to the main screen again, mate.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, John. Whoops, no, I've turned the wrong person off. I turned John off instead. There we go. Well, great stuff there, John. Thanks for the ministry update. A reminder about our upcoming program in the UK. We'll keep pushing this and we'll get more and more details out over the next few days, and they'll be all up on the website, so go and check that out. It promises to be a very unique opportunity. I think only the last time anything like this actually happened, John, was when you came over and did it something like 15 years ago. So it's few and far between, but we're hopefully going to set this up as a commonplace occurrence going forward in the future. And if you would like a little sneak peek, you can do one of two things, or both of them if you wish. You can go to our UK website and you can order the Rocks Cry Out Charmouth and Black Fen with Indiana Joe. It not only takes you sort of through the maps and step by step through the geology, it also has an in-depth section at the back where it teaches you a little bit more about some of the concepts of geology, and it also has a fossil ID guide. So it works actually really well, not only to actually go and visit the place, but because it also comes with a free Rocks Cry Out video, you're actually able to watch the video, get the book, watch it, read it, and it is a really useful piece of information and a useful guide even if you can't visit. Of course, if you can visit, you can follow through, and even better, you can come and join us actually down there in person with myself and other people, and not just go to Charmouth and Black Fen, but also go to 3 other locations down there along the Jurassic Coast in Dorset, and it promises to be a very, very spectacular time there. All right, on to our museum feature of the week. Now, you might think that this lovely face has got something to do with our museum feature. No, this is actually going to be used as an example when we're talking about radioactive and radiocarbon and various other types of dating, right? That's for our main topic. Our museum feature of the week is actually something a little bit different. Now, I'm just going to put me up to full screen for the time being. And so you get a nice close look at what our museum feature is. And then we'll get
Self-portrait,
John
Joseph.
to comment on it.
Well, I can recognize a self-portrait on the right there. I think that's a seahorse that Craig Hawkins owns from the Tasmanian Seahorse World.
Absolutely, yes. Let's just put this up next to it. This is another example from our museum. This is the real thing next to the fossil thing, or the modern thing rather next to the fossil thing. Let's hold it so you can see its whole sort of profile. You should be able to see it's a rather beautiful seahorse from Italy. And yes, John got it right. These do belong technically to Craig. I picked them up in one of the largest fossil fairs in the world in the States. And of course, this was sort of just before COVID time, and COVID actually happened while I was in the States, and so I had to try and rush home to the UK. But I was supposed to go to Australia, and I was supposed to take these and give them to Craig, who technically owns them, and end up in our Creation Museum down in Tasmania. But John, maybe a few comments about, I know we've discussed these before and some of the interesting points that they make. I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 things, but go ahead.
Okay, well, the first one is when I've showed these to Craig, because we also have some for our museum. Craig, of course, for those of you who don't know, runs Seahorse World. His wife is the sort of senior aquaculturalist there, and she specialized in breeding seahorses. And so they have millions of the things. I mean, you don't need too many seahorses to have a million babies even, because the dad, the unusual aspect, the dad has the babies. Mum puts the eggs in the pouch and dad gives birth to them, and sometimes up to 1,000. So when I showed this to Craig first, he said, wow, that's a seahorse. And this one here is actually from Italy, where some of the best known seahorse fossils are found. And you'll see the whole lot's preserved. These are spectacular ones, and they are so easily identifiable because seahorses have not evolved into anything but seahorses.
Absolutely beautiful. Yeah, it's definitely lots of shell mixed in there, so it's been buried really very, very well, including all the details and everything. So it's definitely rapid burial, and it's a living fossil on top of that. Hippocampus ramulosus is the name. So that's a lovely, rolls off the tongue, that, doesn't it? There's our fossil museum feature anyway. So let's move on to our main topic. And John, I think we'll start with you, but just a reminder to everybody, yes, because we've got a lot of people watching now, which is wonderful. We unfortunately still are having trouble with monetization. YouTube has basically blocked our monetization channel. We have got a solution to it. Lord willing, next week we'll be back up. But in the meantime, we still do need your support. So please click on the link in the description below. There's several different links there of how you can donate. I've seen that Brother Timothy has already said that he's going to donate via PayPal. So follow his example. We really, really appreciate it. And also remember, questions. Keep your questions coming, because we will get to them tonight. And if we don't manage to get to them all tonight, then we will always hang on to them to go into programs and Q&As and stuff in the future as well. Make it nice and easy for us. Big capital Q dot, then your question. It just helps us to find them a lot easier. So get your questions in as we are going on with this topic this evening. All right, John, over to you.
Okay,
Carbon dating, radioactive dating, give us the background.
All the above. I'm going to do some open screen first, Joseph. Then you can switch me on to PowerPoint. But just to get you a bit of background, yes, I'm one of the few people that I know of who's actually ever been involved in dating rocks. Now, I come from the old-fashioned education department, geology department, where we still, our degrees were tied into Oxford and Cambridge, so we had to actually date uranium and, those samples, find an age for the rock as part of our course. If we couldn't do it, we actually didn't pass. Praise the Lord, we learned some interesting things, but I might talk a bit about that later. So yes, I have dated rocks. Yes, I know what's involved in it, and I know some of the assumptions. But I also know that when I was at university, I got fascinated with one particular carbon-14 experiment. And this was where they were using radioactive traces. You probably wouldn't be allowed to do this these days. They were putting it in fuel, and they were actually trying to trace the emissions of the fuel and see what they did in the plants alongside the highway. And so they put traces in the fuel, and then they went and they checked the plants, and they were amazed because only some of the plants had absorbed carbon-14. It was always the same sort of plants, and the other plants hadn't at all. So the only conclusion they said they could reach is that some plants could tell the difference between good carbon, the non-radioactive stuff, and the carbon that had radiation, carbon-14, and it converted nitrogen, which we'll come back to later. And so they were amazed, because if this was true, you know, one of the guys who was doing his PhD on this, even he could see the problem. If not every plant, because carbon-14 method depends on carbon-14 getting into plants, if not every plant absorbed carbon-14, then you would end up with some very wrong dates, because the whole theory is based on the assumption that carbon-14 is absorbed by organisms that use carbon. Well, it didn't turn out to be true for the plants alongside the highway. Okay, that's one. Then we did a DVD called Darwin on the Rocks. If you've got a copy handy a bit later, you can show one up, don't Joseph? But involved in that was this rock here. Now, you say that doesn't look too spectacular. No, there's a whole mountain full of it in Hawaii. And I climbed right up, and I wanted one particular specimen. No, I got there late in the day, and the only vehicle they had available was a sports Thunderbird. I've never been on a rocky field trip in a sports Thunderbird. I thought, if I damage this thing, I'm in serious trouble. But anyway, I went there and I walked the last bit to get to the exact known site. The site's well registered. The site's well known. It's marked. It's even written about in the geophysical journal. So what's interesting about this rock? Well, it's volcanic. It's a lava, but it hit the headlines with its history because you can date it in 3 different ways, and they all give different results. Radioactive method involving uranium, lead, etc., potassium argon rather, it gives you dates up to 2.4 billion years of age. Now, that's a lot older than the 3 of us combined. And then you can use helium because it's full of gas bubbles. There's even helium in the rocks. But the helium dates only give you dates up to 600 million years of age. But then the real crunch is that it's sitting up there on the side of the mountain, and we know when it came out of the volcano. It came out in 1801. All the locals will vouch for it, who got ancestors who were there. In fact, it's sitting on the surface. And no, it didn't bring up any old pieces. This is uniform all through. The whole rock has got those 3 different dates. The potassium argon one, vast age. The helium one, really significant age. And the observable one, less than 200 years old. So at the start of our little discussion, it does raise a question when it comes to finding the age of things. What is your source? What do you regard of as reliable evidence? What to you is a valuable, efficient, truthful witness about how old something is? Now, in my case, you could actually, well, if my mum was still alive, you could ask her. You can't ask me because I don't remember the first couple of years. I do have a bit of paper, by the way, that is called a birth certificate, but many countries don't have those. So when you're trying to find out how old something is, what is your basis for doing so? In fact, I put this first question up here to illustrate something. If we can bring the screens up now, Joseph, how old is that and what's your problem? I mean, normally dinosaurs died out nearly 100 million years ago, etc. But you see, I'm old enough to not only have observed some of this stuff, I've not only studied it and done some testing, I've watched things change in age. Welcome to Jenolan Caves in Australia. Now, when you're allowed to, come on back. We need all the tourist dollars that we can get. What's interesting about here? I first visited these caves in 1962. So yes, I was a teenager then. Tells you a little bit how old I am now. Okay, 1962. In 1962, the tourist guide, which I still have, and I believe you can even find it online these days, tells you it is 4,000 years old. Yep, the bush rangers used this cave. They stayed there. They stored their stolen cattle and that there. We knew a lot about this cave, but it was 4,000 years old. What was their framework? Well, you see, they believed the biblical framework of things. The world was 6,000 or so thousand years of age. The flood was sort of 4,000 years ago. This is all made of limestone. Limestone, yes, you heard me correctly. These are biblical-based dates. The limestone was all full of sea creatures, and this limestone is on a vast area and related to Noah's flood. So therefore, 4,000 years old. But I went back in 2008, and by then it was 400 million years old. And as I love to say, boy, it had been a long time since I was at the caves, don't you think? No, what had happened was between 1962, when the biblical worldview was just beginning to be totally rejected in Australia, and the Charles Darwin evolutionist Charles Lyell view was coming in, one thing it showed up in was the age of rocks. Not because the rocks had changed, but because the philosophy of the scientists and the teachers had changed. Did you catch that? The people wanted things to be old. They no longer believed the biblical record. So in case you think we're bringing religion into it and tying up with carbon-14, it's always been involved. If you pick the wrong religion, you'll use the wrong facts to back it up. Another illustration. Look at this lovely big road cutting. One year in the USA, I decided to take a shortcut through Kentucky. I passed this cutting. And do you see what's there in the middle of this supposedly 300 million year old rock? Well, it's a nice big drainage system coming out of the layer up near the top. This is all limestone. And when you get up close, you can actually see its browny gunk. So it's fairly tall. In fact, by the time you get to the actual cutting, it's about 10 meters tall. And you can actually see how wide the thing is, because when you get up close, the top part is still growing because it's got water on it. And not only is it growing, it's growing moss because it's perpetually damp. Okay, you go a bit closer and you can actually see, well, there's my driver for the day. They try not to let me drive in the USA because, as Joseph will have found, they all drive on the wrong side of the road over there.
I know, it's terrible.
It's interesting. So I always try and get a driver so I don't sort of smash into anybody on the way to collect fossils and rocks. Now, if you look at this guy here, yeah, that's me. That's right. The world's living fossil. It was a wet, miserable day. And there's many of these little flows. Yes, they are flows. They're made of, well, what are they made of? Well, when you actually go into them, they're coming out of the limestone. You get up close, you can see they're growing mossy stuff, whether it's the low ones or the tall ones. And when you break a piece off, there's the green mossy stuff on the outside. There's the whiter stuff on the inside. And when you get a bit closer, wow, these are actually made of moss that's absorbed lime coming out of the rock. And when you put some hydrochloric acid on it, you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt it's not just calcium, it's calcium carbonate. These are limestone growths. This is 10 meters tall, it's made of lime, and it's actually petrifying any moss that's growing because they're perpetually wet. All right, what's interesting about this? You go to the caves, they tell you these things take a long time. Oh, you go to Jenolan caves, don't touch the stalactites, they take vast ages. Well, this is bigger than most stalactites in the Jenolan caves because this road only opened in 2009. How do we know? I got the locals to check. we checked with the Main Roads Department or the Tennessee Division of the same, and found out when this road cut was made. So at the most, this was only showing in 2005, because that's when they started digging. So this is not very old at all. It wasn't there until they cut the rock open. I took the picture in 2015, and at most that growth, 30 feet tall, 10 meters tall, and you'll find it's up to half a meter thick of lime. It wasn't there in 2005.
John,
Wow.
just to jump
Yep.
in and clarify something very quickly,
Yep.
right? Because one of the big criticisms that we get of things like our stalactite machine, right? I remember when you first started it, it's a concrete trough, right? Now, you and I know the chemistry of concrete, and you know it is essentially limestone because it comes from limestone. But some of the criticisms we got from lots of people, including people who supported the rapid formation of stalactites, is that, well, you can't actually compare them to natural caves because you're dealing with a man-made concrete, you're dealing with a man-made substance, right? Now we can go off into the chemistry and the debate all on that, but this roadside cutting, that is natural limestone, correct?
It's 100% natural limestone, and the lime that's coming out in the water is 100% natural limestone, and it's happening at that scale, at that rate, in less than 10 years.
Yeah. So
Right?
the
So
only
it's
thing that
very
the road
similar.
cutting did was actually just create the cave in a, quicker than perhaps a cave could form naturally. And there's debate over rates of cave formation. You're literally just digging into natural rock, creating essentially a natural cave. It's a big hole, right? It just so happens that you stick a road through it. It's a completely purely natural phenomena, and it's growing at this rate, which is remarkable.
It is remarkable, and it's basically a mimic of our limestone machine, our
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
stalactite machine, because it makes the same point. It is not time that caused this to grow; it's the actual process, and the process is always aided by the presence of organic materials. The actual moss that's growing there actually is catching and precipitating the lime far better than just using the chemistry. If you go to the cave and you wait for the chemistry alone of lime in water plus CO2 to produce a stalactite, you will take forever. But if you throw in bacteria or lime, it'll happen far quicker. Okay, personal experience. I'm sitting in a shed that we turned into our creation research office on my property, which lives, well, it used to be the bush, is now on the edge of the city, and it's still fairly rural. But when I first bought this place, the dates that you got from the textbook had already been through several changes. It used to be regarded as Precambrian rock. Why? Because nobody found any fossils in the rocks under my house. In the 1960s, it changed to Ordovician. That's a decrease of several hundred million. In the 1960s, they found a portion of a trilobite on the north side of town, and because this rock is a huge rock, if you want to know how huge, it goes from Cape York all the way down to Tasmania. This is a big bed of rock. But then in the 1970s, when I was still finishing university, they found a portion of a fossil out on the western side of Brisbane, and the fossil, by everybody's explanation, was Carboniferous. Now, do you realise that means it had got 200 to 300 million years younger, while yours truly has got 50 or 60 years older? Can you see the contradiction? Because what it means is we don't live in a world where scientists are interested in the age of a rock at all. Scientists today don't care how old a rock is, only how old it isn't. And you and I need to come to grips with that. We're going to have sort of a break for any questions in a moment. I'll do this in several sections because this whole topic of dating, well, most of us have no experience of dating except with girls or getting older. The first point you need to know in this whole discussion is that scientists don't care how old a rock is, only how old it isn't. In fact, when I first got involved in this issue, that's what I came across. I was in the science department at Brisbane Grammar School, And this book was doing the rounds, 1984. National Academy of Sciences, what a prestigious group. And they published a book on science and creationism. And this was included on the section of the age of the earth. Scientists knew the earth was old before they knew how old. Now, can I suggest, if you want to see how logical that is, try that on a woman sometimes. I know how old you are, even though I don't know how old you are. Slap. You're not going to get a good reaction to that. Scientists knew that the earth was old before they knew how old. What nonsense. If you wrote scientists believed the world was old before they knew how old it was, that's a little closer to the truth. But what we need to realize is that the hidden rules involved in dating things, involved in even carbon-14 or uranium-lead or the helium method that was used on that rock from the islands in the Pacific, it's based on Charles Lyell's present is the key to the past. Charles Lyell is paramount in all of this. Now, I know you can read American creation books on geology and you hardly find a mention of him, but you need to. You need to read about him even in your present day evolutionary geology books, and they skip his hidden principles, his hidden view. The present is the key to the past. Where's that picture? That's the British Natural History Museum geology section. Whatever carbon-14 is doing now, it's always done. No, don't criticize me. Charles Lyell knew nothing about radioactivity. He knew nothing about carbon-14. But what the principle he gave us, whatever a thing is doing now, it's always done. That's why even Charles Darwin said this. Lyell is most firmly convinced he has shaken faith in the flood and creation far more efficiently by never having said a word against the Bible than if he'd acted otherwise. Now, be honest. You're in the USA, you're in Canada, you're in Australia, you're in England. You never read that statement from Charles Lyell in your biology books or your geology books. Charles Lyell, Charles Darwin had an agenda. Their aim was to get rid of the biblical view, to get rid of the works of Moses, to get rid of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I'm going to free science from Moses. In other words, I'm going to make what has been previously godly into something that's not only ungodly, it's anti-godly. Now, Joseph, there's a good place to bring yourself back up and add some comments that you might want to make before we do some detail on carbon-14. Or Diane, if you've got anything you want to throw in, it's now a good time to put the first lot in. I've got about 3 or 4 segments on this, but it can be so complicated sometimes. We need to take it in little bits.
Well, before we go back and start breaking down the sort of the carbon-14 and stuff, I think it's really important to recognize that point that you've just made in its fullness. You know, I've had people high up in academia who and even people, you know, who are Christians and creationists and believe like we do, who genuinely think that the invention of stuff like carbon-14 dating, the invention of stuff like radioactive dating, like uranium to lead or potassium to argon or whatever, that's when the belief in an old Earth really came to be, because all of a sudden these dating methods were, you know, pouring out, oh, look, this Earth is, you know, 500 million years old according to this geological sample we've got. Oh, look, this Egyptian thing has been dated to be 6,000 to 7,000 years old, therefore it's far too old to fit into the Bible. And these people, these you know, very knowledgeable, very well learned people, because they're so wrapped up in, I suppose it's the academic side of stuff, there's no looking into the history. Now, something which you and I talk about a lot, John, is how important history is in order to actually understand the full perspective, right? I mean, if you want to understand why we're in the mess we're in today, you need a history lesson, right? It's called sin. It started with Adam, the first man. So you need to know your history, even from a biblical perspective, in order to understand why we need a savior. But it's true about so many other things as well, even when you're talking about these issues with Ukraine, when you're talking about things like climate change, when you're talking about issues like carbon dating, you need to know your history. And this key point of, you know, the scientists knew that the Earth was old before they knew how old. Well, the new is a bit ambiguous there, but it really is true. They certainly promoted a very, very old Earth, long before you had any kind of concept of radioactive or radiometric dating methods or anything of the like. It was a philosophical decision to make the Earth old, based on old Greek ideas, which were themselves based on old Babylonian ideas, which themselves were based off of a rejection of truth, a rejection of the true account, the scriptural account of history. So you really need to know your history in all of this. And really what we're dealing with when we're dealing with radioactive methods and radiocarbon methods and all this kind of dating stuff, we're dealing with essentially a secondary issue, an important issue because it's such a public one, but it's a secondary issue compared with the philosophy which underlies the belief in millions of years in the first place. So those are my thoughts from what we've said already. John and Diane, over to you, and then we'll have a look and see if there's any questions before we move on to the next part.
All right. Well, I'll sort of give you a brief summary now. I was asked one year to spend 5 days in the University of Adelaide. So what I'm about to do is cherry pick some of those bits on dating, because that was the biggest single issue, that and mutation, natural selection, of everything that I spoke about. So let me give you a summary of carbon-14, and then we'll have another break, and Diane will take over a little bit after that on the biological aspects of radiation, which is pretty interesting stuff. Okay, bring my screen back up again, Joseph. If you like a bit of history, then, you know, Madame Curie, I think she's going to come into Diane's talk. Franz Curie in 1934, similar spelling. Carbon-14's existence was suggested by him in 1934. It was discovered by the blokes there at the University of California, but the dating method was devised by Willard Libby. Now, basically, he was inventing a clock, and you may want to think about it. If you invent a new clock, the first thing you need to know is what time is it, because your clock is supposed to go backwards. Now, one of the most interesting things I found was a comment by Walter Libby, who says that he struck some problems because he couldn't find any literature that was older than 4,000 or so years, you know, back to the biblical flood. It's even written in his notes. That's the oldest he could find to compare it against. And then he found a problem with the measurements. And here's what he said about the problem he found with the measurements. If one were to imagine the cosmic radiation, why that? Because that's how it's produced. Cosmic radiation hits nitrogen that converts it into radioactive carbon. If one were to imagine that the cosmic radiation had been turned off, in other words, it hasn't always been the same. A short while ago, the enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to the equilibrium state, you see carbon-14, like many things where you use equations, 3x has to equal 9. If you don't know what x is, and you don't know what 9 is, and you don't know what 3 is, then you don't have an equation. You can't solve anything. The enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to the equilibrium state would not have been manufactured. And the specific radioactivity of living matter, that's carbon-14 in you, would be much less than the rate of production calculated from neutron intensity. Now, I guarantee your teacher in year 10 or year 11 or Woman's Weekly, who told you how carbon-14 proves things old, never ever mentioned this. Okay, it's important. Libby said he couldn't find any documents to match his carbon-14 against. Secondly, there was a problem. If you try to prove it's always been, you can't. It looks like it started fairly recently. Even in 2012, 60 years later almost, various geological, atmospheric and solar processes can influence atmospheric carbon-14 levels. This means the formation of carbon-14 is not constant. Since the formation of carbon-14, says Science Daily in October 2012, it's affected by Earth's magnetic field and solar activity and is therefore not constant. This relative timescale has no absolute timestamp in calendar years. So when you see statements, Aborigines have been in Australia for 70,000 years, that's a non-factual statement. You see, when I was a student, they hadn't been in Australia for 4,000 years. They got off Noah's Ark and walked like everybody else. Well, like many people, because they didn't have ocean-going boats. Even when you try to date Neanderthals, Look at the statement from the University of Leeds. The radiocarbon chronometer is like a clock, sometimes running faster, but sometimes it stops. Now we're in 2000s. We're not in the 1800s. We're not in the 1700s. We're not in the 1900s. We're a long time after we've had opportunity to test and test and test. And of course, you get some funny ones. Radiocarbon Journal. If you have access to it, can I encourage you? When they first started doing radiocarbon, they invented this journal and they would file every result they got. It's a valuable resource because they weren't sophisticated enough to realize they were shooting themselves in the foot so often. The hair on the Shakuvova mammoth was found to have a carbon-14 age of 26,000 years, but the peaty soil in which it was preserved was found to have a date of only 5,600 years. Now, I guess you can reach two conclusions. One is it took an awful long time to be buried and still have its hair intact. 5,000 from 26,000 is about 19,000 years to bury the thing. Alternatively, it died really slowly from inside out. So you get some funny results, some silly results. The same as you get with the seals. When the blood of a seal, and I first used this many, many years ago when I edited the Creation Journal. When the blood of a seal freshly killed at McMurdo Sound in the Antarctic was tested by carbon-14, it showed the seal had died 1,300 years ago. And we didn't invent it to put it in the Creation magazine. We borrowed it from others who'd used it before us, 1971. And of course, since then, they've discovered that they have to get rid of all the C values because the water itself affects the rate at which the carbon-14 will be absorbed. And of course, here's the conflict. Remember how our friend had Charles Lyell said, my aim is to get rid of Moses? There's a literal reading of Genesis through to Matthew. Jesus is roughly 2,000 years ago. Moses, roughly 3,500. Babel, roughly 4,300. If you say the Aborigines have been here for 70,000 years, what are you doing to people's confidence in this record? Okay, by the time you get back to the first Adam, he's only 6,000 years ago, roughly. Now, the reality is they've achieved exactly what Lyell wanted. You want to get rid of Moses? Then change the dates. And it doesn't matter how many times you change the radiocarbon dates, you actually have never proved it, and yet you destroyed the opposition very subtly. When people say, oh, what about carbon-14? It's because they have no idea how the others work. I've got a few here that I'm going to check as we go through the program on coal and diamonds. And I'm going to finish with a look at working the thing backwards from a doctor who actually was my consultant at the Los Alamos Radioactive Project. But notice the last point. Are you one of those who will put faith in the biblical record, or will you put faith in Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin? Because that's your only choices. I wasn't there when the world was made. Joseph is even younger than I am. And Diane, she's somewhere in between. And we do not know from observation. But we either trust God who was there, who never lies, or we trust the scientists who've changed the values over and over again. Now, if you want to see more evidence on this, I'm going to bring up a book in a moment and a couple of other things. I'm going to take myself back off screen, Joseph. So, Diane, if you want to ask anything, or Joseph wants to ask anything, I brought in two books here, which I'll talk about first. And I know they can get these from you, Joseph. They can get that one.
Absolutely.
Bites and Fossil Bites. That's on our research on fossil formation and rocks at Jurassic Ark. And this one here that Diane and I put together with many of the quotes and useful references. So, Diane, where did many of these things come from?
Well, a lot of them are questions that were sent in to us. And we actually have a website that's devoted to questions, simply called Ask John Mackay. So that's easy to remember. It's now got a few hundred questions on it. So do have a look through that. And if we haven't answered a question that you have, you can submit it there and we will deal with it. So we've decided we would put together a book looking at the different topics that have come out. just through this long process of people sending in questions. So we have started at the beginning. So that first one there that John has just held up, and I've got a copy of it here as well. This first one, we start at the beginning. So we start with the days of creation. We look at the whole issue of could God have used evolution? Is Genesis real history or just theological theory? And we look at Adam and Eve as well, and a bit about the supposed link between people and apes. So that's back at the beginning. But do have a look at that site, and you'll find lots of questions about all sorts of things, including carbon-14, and including.
Diane,
yes.
Isn't it true that the commonest questions deal with how long were the days and the age of the Earth and all those sort of things? That's the commonest ones we get asked.
Yes, indeed. People go to all sorts of lengths to avoid the plain meaning of the Bible. They're looking for excuses to make the days longer, to make the age of the earth longer. So there are quite a few questions on that.
Okay, yeah. So Joseph or Diane, any comments on what I've just mentioned?
Well, I'll have a little look back through and see if we've got any questions that have been sent in, but that might just take me a moment while I look through. So, Diane, feel free to comment or ask any questions about stuff that John's mentioned so far. Maybe it'd be a good time perhaps to have a talk about what you were going to have a look at, Diane, about the sort of the ages and the effects of radioactive stuff before we come back to this sort of question of carbon-14 and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I would like to reinforce the point about the what both Joseph and John said about the historical records versus the what scientists have tried to work out from observing things that we have in the present and making conclusions about what's gone in the past, where we do have the observations of when that volcano in Hawaii erupted. We do have observations of when things were buried. We have old documents, and even the easiest way to remember is how old are you? How do you know how old you are? Well, you don't remember, but there were witnesses who recorded the fact and recorded when it happened. It's always important to remember: do we have any actual observations of when something happened? Because that's what really matters. That's what really will get you to the truth. Anyway, yes, we are talking about radioactivity. And of course, people immediately think, oh, radioactivity, that's terrible, that's dangerous. I remember in my young days, the threat of nuclear war was considered the thing that was going to end the world rather than climate change. And so there were all sorts of alarmist headlines about what could happen if there was nuclear war, because that would spread a whole lot of radioactivity on the earth. And there is a grain of truth in that, because radioactivity is dangerous. So we need to think, well, was there radioactivity when the world was made? Because it's seriously dangerous. It does harm you. Now, carbon-14 is not all that dangerous unless you breathe it in or unless you swallow any, because the sort of radioactivity that it emits it's called low-level beta emissions, which don't go very far. So you can protect your skin with just the normal sort of protection that you would wear in an ordinary lab if you are working with it. But you must be careful not to breathe it in. If it actually gets inside your body, it can do a lot of damage. But there are other forms of radioactivity from other decay processes that can cause a lot more damage. So the threat of nuclear war, or the threat of radioactivity being let out into the environment, was a serious one. And of course, these days, we not quite so scared of that, but it has been raised a bit now with the war in Ukraine and a certain dangerous person who has an arsenal of nuclear weapons available to him, and there are other places in the world where there are still nuclear weapons available. But what does it do to living things? Why is such a terrible threat? Well, basically, it can DNA. It can damage DNA, which means it's going to damage the normal cellular processes, your genetic material. So one of the results of exposure to radiation is cancer. And in fact, John, you mentioned Madame Curie. She was originally Polish rather than French, but she married a Frenchman, Pierre Curie, who sadly died in an accident fairly young, but she carried on with his work. And the first element that they discovered together was actually called polonium, after Poland. And they went on to then find radium. Sadly, she died later on of a radiation-induced disease. It was probably leukemia. And we know that people who are exposed to radiation from radiation accidents are at there's a much higher rate of them getting cancer, particularly leukemia, but any other cancers because of that radiation. And that's to do with the damage to do with their DNA. There is also a disease called acute radiation sickness, which is just the damage to the whole cells. And so that involves damaging the linings of the internal body structures where you've got cells that are multiplying rapidly, that they're badly affected. And people can die for that. Remember the Chernobyl accident and the Fukushima accident. People did die of acute radiation poisoning there. But the long-term effects are to do with damage to DNA in your own lifetime that can cause cancer. It also increases the rate of aging, because the aging process is basically where we can no longer repair our that are breaking down. This is happening all the time. It's just part of the normal chemical processes that go on during life. But we have repair mechanisms. But if they get knocked out, then we can no longer repair ourselves, and eventually the degenerating processes catch up with us, and that's the end of our earthly life. Now, it's very interesting when you look in the Bible and look at the ages of people, and a lot of people scoff at this, but yes, there's a graph of the ages of people, and we have had people write into the Ask site and ask, well, how could people live these long ages? Now, you probably can't see the actual figures on that graph, but for the first 10 generations, it sort of bumps along around the 900 mark, with one notable exception, which we discussed in a previous program. So you might like to look at that. And then it seems to fall over a cliff rather, and settle down to eventually between 70 and 80. And the last item on that column graph is actually a reference to Psalm 90, which was written by Moses. And there is a line in that psalm that says, the classic 70 or 70 years is our lifespan, 80 if you're particularly strong. So between 70 and 80. And all of our modern medicine has only been able to stretch that to maybe 80 to 90 in countries like Australia and the UK and Western Europe and and North America, where you've got very good medical care and good medical treatment of some of the diseases that can actually be caused by radiation, like cancer. We can now treat a lot of cancers, whereas only a few decades ago, they would take you out fairly soon after they'd been diagnosed. So it's interesting to have a look at that sequence there. We've gone from 900 down to less than 90 So something must have happened. So maybe we can go back to John and Joseph and look at that in the light of what's changed in the overall environment, particularly on the issue of radioactivity.
Okay, well, a simple comment from me, and then we'll go back to carbon-14. And, well, we're going to call it carbon-14 for dummies, because that's what most of us are in this field. Now, Joseph and I have done a lot of work in the USA. I've done a lot more than him. The Lord has granted me a few more decades playing with the American rocks. Even though we haven't been there for a couple of years, we're intending to go back, God willing. But there's an area in Tennessee, and it goes all the way up into Kentucky. And in fact, I followed it all the way up to Canada and down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's a rock formation called the Chattanooga Shale. In fact, our office sits not far from where that's exposed. Now, what's interesting? Well, in World War II, when they were desperate for making atomic bombs, they discovered that this rock actually contained microscopic grains of uranium. And not just in a few places, everywhere. They still have no idea how you can end up with gazillion tons of uranium microscopically distributed from the Gulf of Mexico through to Canada, but it meant that it was a radioactive shale. Now, as I love to tell young men, because I take them on field trips, we take young ladies too, but the warning is more for the boys. If you collect some of this, because it's got interesting fossils in it, don't keep it in your pocket. It will damage your reproductive apparatus. It's not a very helpful thing for you to do. Outside of that, however, the radon that's coming off is not really too much of a threat. There's not enough of it. And if you've got just a short amount of protection, you'll be protected fairly well from this minor amount of radiation. I've gone looking for mutations in the valley where this is exposed, and sure enough, you find a slightly greater number of mutated plants. You know, where the chlorophyll doesn't make uniformly, or where some of them are stunted and grown purely from the material left in the seed, and they'll die all little and shriveled up.
I've noticed it's also particularly prevalent where there are road cuts, where presumably it's gone down where the radioactive material is fresh, and you do get a much larger number of these strange mutated plants. In fact, I remember last time I was there in the USA, I was on my own. I wasn't with John, and our sort of resident geologist friend there, Bob Powell. We actually tried a road that had never taken you down before, John, and we found a brand new exposure of the Chattanooga Shale, including some fantastic fossils, but full of these mutated plants. And you think, well, these mutated plants are here, and there's people who live on top of this radioactive material all of their lives, and you wonder how much build-up and how much effect it actually has on these people. But yeah, for sure, these mutations are really there, and it really is being affected by this radioactive material.
And of course, it's more of a problem in the USA, where either for tornado protection or for just winter and storage, they build underground sort of basements, and the rock is all radioactive, and the radon gas, because it's a heavy gas, is not only radioactive, it does not escape. Now, that's where you're making yourself a radiation kill me trap, right? And that's what does happen. But overall, through the country where it is, it's not much of a serious issue, even though it is radioactive. Okay, now carbon-14. Okay, when you have a look at the carbon-14 issue, I've got to find my little mouse, it's run away here. I've called it this section here so that you can understand that when the Women's Week magazine says carbon-14 proves the world is millions of years old, it shows that not only are they dummies, they're really dumb dummies. So to show you how it actually works, cosmic rays, high energy rays coming from outer space, in the atmosphere, they will begin to hit atoms, particularly atoms of nitrogen, and they will release neutrons. And what you find is the nitrogen gets converted. It's got 14 particles inside it. So instead of being nitrogen 14, it gets sort of messed up and becomes carbon 14. Radioactive? Well, you see, the interesting principle that God has built into our creation is the principle that everything tends to try to get back to what's normal, to the stable state. So if you've added energy to nitrogen and it bumps a proton and neutron, etc., and everything gets out of place, it will try and get rid of that extra energy and go back to being ordinary carbon. So in the meantime, it becomes radioactive carbon, and the radiation is what's given off for it to try and go back. Okay, the carbon-14, which is very reactive, will react immediately with oxygen, making radioactive carbon dioxide. Enter the green world. Not the greenies of the politics, but the fact is the radioactive CO2 is absorbed by plants. Now, you heard me before. We used to think it was absorbed by all plants evenly, but that simply turns out to be false. But the one thing that is true there is that the plants are eaten by animals. Now, put it in your mind, what's the next problem here? I'm going to dig up an Aboriginal skeleton, I'm going to dig up a wooden boomerang, and I'm going to try and find out how old it is. Well, if I want to date animals or plants, it's true that you eat the animals, and if they've been eating radioactive plants, you now get radioactive. And the trouble is, we don't want to find out when you lived, we want to find out when you die, because the carbon-14 method only works on you when you are dead. Okay, how does this happen? Well, you see, when you're dead, it's a well-known fact that you stop eating, right? So therefore, at that point, at the point of death, the amount of radioactive carbon in you simply can't build up any further. It's leaking radioactivity, and dead people do leak. Lots of things. Radiation is one of them. And here's the simple fact. The longer you are dead, the theory tells us the less carbon-14 you have left. Of course, it assumes you know how much carbon-14 you had. There's all sorts of things around. And when Walter Libby invented a new method of actually trying to find out how long something had been dead, not when it lived, but how long it had been dead. I remember the puns made on Walter Libby's method when I grew up big enough to understand it. Let's rock around the clock tonight. Oh, no, that's Elvis. Let's clock around the rock tonight. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to invent a new clock, a radioactive timer. And if the radioactive timer actually worked, the way in which we measure it, you should run out of detectable radioactive carbon-14 after about 80,000 years. Issue? All right. If you find an Aboriginal boomerang and you find that the boomerang dates at 70,000 years old by carbon-14, then whoever made it was here 70,000 years ago. You following the logic? But you see, the Bible that the missionaries brought to the Aborigines said there was nobody here 70,000 years ago, because wasn't even any here to be. Okay, Captain Cook arrives in the 1700s, and the biblical account of creation goes back at the most to the Tower of Babel before the Aborigines started to migrate. And in case you think that's sort of just made up to fit the Bible, no, I've been to India. The Aborigines in India have boomerangs. The Aborigines, yes, Aboriginal just means ab-original, the original inhabitants. The Indians, they actually had dingoes. So we got no doubt about it, they came here from somebody else. Diamonds? How did diamonds get into it? Because they're a girl's best friend. And they actually are interesting, because if you want to get your girlfriend's diamond ring, you know, the $10,000 one, £5,000 when you bought her, you can actually convert it to carbon-14. Well, you can actually convert it to carbon by burning it. It's a little expensive fire, but you discover that you can date your diamonds with carbon-14. The theory says diamonds are at least 990 million years old, and some are up to 3.2 billion years old. Now, this is pretty old. Hence the logic, diamonds are forever. I think they made a movie called that. But when you find out that carbon-14 exists in diamonds, you have a little problem. Diamonds can be dated by other radioactive schemes, because we find uranium lead is actually in those tiny little, they're not holes, but they're inclusions of other materials in the diamonds. But the diamonds are so old, carbon-14 theoretically only lasts until 80,000 years max. So no diamond should have carbon-14 in it. Now, do you see these graphs? No, sorry, these not graphs, but accumulations of data on diamonds. Now, you can go to the carbon-14 journals and get all of these for yourselves. They make interesting reading. because there is not only one diamond that's got carbon-14 in it, there's hundreds, and they're all listed in location. And the average percentage of carbon-14 for the 12 diamonds shown is 0.09 plus or minus 0.025 of modern carbon in the diamond itself. Wow. What you find is that this simply tells you that the diamonds weren't here millions of years ago. And the same is true for coal. I've been amazed at, number one, how many coals actually show up with carbon-14 in it. And you might be amazed to find that many coal mines are full of uranium lead as well at the same time. Something's wrong, folks. It's not the facts that are leading people astray here with rejecting the age of the Bible. It's not the evidence that disagrees with the biblical record of creation and Noah's flood. It's actually the mindset, the opinions of men who deliberately and willfully set out to reject and replace the word of God. Now, do you know what? It took me a long time to reach that conclusion, because I'll be honest, I actually had an attitude. I'll put up one verse to finish off this section with, and then we'll throw it open to questions from Diane or Joseph can take over his section, and then we'll throw it open to questions from everyone. See this verse here? If you believe Moses, you'd believe me, said Jesus, for Moses wrote of me. But since you don't believe what Moses wrote, how will you believe what I say? Now, you remember the statement I made right at the start? Scientists don't care how old a rock is, only how old it isn't. Why? Because they've already rejected the only reliable source, the God who was there, who revealed to Moses what he'd done. Yep, that's what they did. That's what I had troubles with. Let me put it onto open screen now, Joseph, if you wouldn't mind. We're there. Because the reality is, when I was a student and you're impressed by all of these professors and they've got all their PhDs lined up and they all believe the world is really old, and then you discover the age of the rock in your house has gotten younger and younger, at the same time as the age of the rock in that next coal mine has gotten older and older, and then you actually have to do some radioactive dating, and you discover that the 10 students in the tutorial, they all get 10 different results, and the professor said, that's okay, let's even them out on a statistical graph. At that point, I became a doubter. I didn't know what to do about it because I couldn't see the problem. The problem was not the evidence. The problem was I was so convinced that my professors were experts, and I didn't know their whole aim was to get rid of Moses. I thought geology was objective. No, those scientists, my professors, my tutors, didn't care how old the world was. They didn't care if it got older or younger, as long as it didn't get anywhere near the age of the biblical account of Moses. I'll re-emphasize one point. There is no evidence that contradicts with the Bible. And Joseph, it's a good time to bring archaeology and carbon-14. The evidence supports the Bible, and it's the opinions of men that disagree with it. And I struggled for years. Even when I became convinced of creation, I struggled with this whole issue of how old things were, until I realized one thing. You can't take millions of years to try and make something. You either make it and get it right the first time, or it don't work. Joseph, that's a good point for you to come in.
I think so. I think what we'll do is I'll talk about one or two things and then do a bit of backwards and forwardsing with you, John, talking a bit about the archaeological side of stuff and the evidence for the evidence that carbon-14 supports scripture. And then I think we'll open it to questions. We've had a few questions come in. People have said that some of their questions are too long to go in the chat. If you want to stick it in an email, the email address is info@creationresearchuk.com. I've put a link up in the chat already, so just send us an email. I've got it up here in front of me. Anything we will see straight away. info@creationresearchuk.com. All right, let's sort of wrap things up a little bit and move on to the archaeological side of stuff. Let's start back at the beginning. Remember what Diane was saying earlier? Carbon-14 is radioactive. You have a radioactive material which decays into a stable material, which is carbon-12. Carbon-14 to carbon-12, radioactive to stable. Carbon-14 is a naturally occurring thing. It happens, it comes down, you eat it, you're radioactive. You breathe it in, you're
Excuse
radioactive.
me, Joseph, if you don't mind. Forgive me, folks. I'm going to have to sort of disappear for a little while and come on back. So you enjoy Joseph's talk. I've heard it before. It's good. Catch you soon.
Are you coming back on this program, John, or are we saying goodbye?
Yeah, I will be back up here in a little
All
while.
right, that's fine. No worries. We'll see you in a bit, John. All right. Carbon-14, radioactive. And Diane's already told you about some of the problems that this radioactive material has. And she's mentioned, and I know this, when you go into a carbon-14 lab, you wear your mask because you don't want that radioactive material getting into your living skin that's inside of you, right? It's not too bad on your skin outside because your skin's dead, right? On the outside, it can't really penetrate it very much, but you certainly do not want it being breathed in. All right, question. When God created the world, and he created the world very good, how much radioactive material, how much carbon-14 was Adam breathing in? The answer is none. The world was very good, right? There was nothing like that being breathed in by Adam. There was no radioactive material altering his DNA and causing him to degenerate because the world was very good. Therefore, step one, according to your Bible, something has changed between the creation of the world and today. And that something which has changed has jump-started the production and the intake of carbon-14. So something has had to change. Is this backed up by science? It is. There's evidence that the Earth's magnetic field was stronger in the past. Okay, stronger magnetic field means less chance for radioactive material in the upper atmosphere to actually reach the lower atmosphere for it to be breathed in by humans. Less of it to be breathed in by plants and then consumed by humans. Another interesting point as well. I mean, you think about the way that carbon-14 dating works, it assumes that there is stability and it assumes there is consistency throughout all of time. And yet, if there was changes in Earth's atmosphere, there's going to be differences in the ratios of radioactive carbon-14 that's being intaken by humans and intaken by animals and intaken by plants. So that's your first point. Secondly, there's evidence from the fossil record, and John will attest to this, that Earth's not only climate in the past was different, but there was a far greater abundance of vegetation. Now, if you are using your radiocarbon-14 dating methods, right, which assume consistency in the past, well, if you assume consistency, you assume that the production of carbon-14 was consistent. What's going to happen if you suddenly double or triple or quadruple the amount of plant material? It's the same amount of radioactive carbon being distributed over 4 times the amount of plant material. In other words, you have far less radioactive material per plant, therefore the ratios are going to be different, therefore your dating is going to be out. Now, not only does this support a biblical model, because in the beginning everything was very good, the Bible talks about one land mass, and it talks about one water mass, and it talks about the land mass being very good in terms of climate as well. Optimum climate to live and grow and survive in for humans and plants. Greater amounts of plants, and even if there were radioactive material, which we know there wasn't until after Adam sinned at least, right? But it's also backed up by science as well, greater amounts of vegetation. Now, all of these things have to be kept in check. They have to be kept in mind when you're dealing with radiocarbon dating, and radioactive dating as well, actually, but certainly radiocarbon dating. It has to be kept in mind because these are going to change your equations. They're going to change your ratios. They're going to change the way that you are actually doing the dating. All right, that's your first and very, very important point. More plants, less radiocarbon, all this kind of stuff. All right, let's talk a little bit about the archaeology, because this is something which I'm starting to get more and more interested in and more involved in academically as well, with access to various laboratories around the world and various discussion groups which we're getting involved in. Ever since the invention of carbon-14 dating, there has not been any tests done, there have not been any discussions done, there have not been any research done on actually calibrating the dating methods. In other words, we've had nothing to actually test this against. Now, we've come on in leaps and bounds in terms of scientific and investigations into radioactive molecules and the way that atoms and stuff interact ever since it was first invented, but there's not been any tests, there's not been any decisions, there's not been any issues or research groups actually trying to calibrate these dating methods. Now, this is something which we're trying to get interested in and investigate, and these rather interesting archaeological specimens actually have something to do with that. What are we dealing with here? This is a mummy mask from ancient Egypt, and that's not the only ancient Egyptian artifact we've got. We've also got this rather interesting little figurine here as well. Let's see if I hold it in front of the face, whether it comes into focus or not. It's wooden. Both of these are made out of cedar wood. They've been carved into a beautiful shape. They certainly didn't happen like this by themselves. It's definitely evidence for design. It is indeed a creation, and then we can talk about all of that. But most importantly, it's made out of cedar wood. And also doubly importantly, this has not been carbon-14 dated. Why? There is simply no need for it, because the style, the wood, the carving, all this kind of stuff tells you all that you need to know about the dates. This comes from the third intermediate period in Egypt's history. Third intermediate period. Now, this is a period in Egyptian history. One of the things that you'll know if you know anything about Egyptian chronology, you've divided it up into the Old Kingdoms and the New Kingdoms and the late periods and the intermediate periods and everything else as well. And, oops, my computer screen has just gone. Can you still see me, Diane?
Yes, I can still see you and still hear you. Yes.
Okay, let me see if I can just get it back on, because I've completely frozen this in this area. Oh, there we are. We're back. Right, there we are.
Good.
That's good. Right, so the third intermediate period is around. It's around sort of 1000 to 664, somewhere in that kind of period BC. So you're talking about up to 3000 years old. Now, this is key because, of course, biblically, if you look at your biblical chronology, you've got Noah's flood happening around 4,500 years ago, or 4,400 years ago. You've got the Tower of Babel happening a few hundred years after that, and you've got the rise of Egypt and stuff happening about this kind of time. But this is the third intermediate period. There's the first and the second, and even before that, there was the early kingdom and the old kingdom, and all these kind of dates which struggle to fit in scripture. I mean, you saw John's point earlier about the Aborigines, right? If you've radiocarbon dated something to 70,000 years, you know for sure that you can't trust your Bible, because your Bible talks about only a few thousand years, 6 to 10,000 years at the absolute most. And some Egyptian chronology goes back even further than that. So you've got an interesting little conundrum. Now, the importance of these figures is that they have actually been professionally dated. We work with the same kind of people who work in the British Natural History Museum and the British Museum in London, people who study these for a job, right? People who really know what they're talking about. And these come with wonderful provenance, they come with wonderful certification, and they come with detailed reports that tell you, yes, from the style, from the paint, from the stuff that we've analysed, we know what date these are actually come to. Now, that's a very key point in archaeology, right? 9 times out of 10, 99% of the time, you don't actually need to use carbon-14 dating for 2 reasons. Number one, you can't, because it's a metal or it hasn't got anything organic or biological. And number two, your skeleton is buried with enough grave goods and enough identifiable things to actually date it. You simply don't need carbon-14 dating to do that. What about the 1% of the time? Well, the 1% of the time, it can be very useful, because we know that carbon dating is accurate up to a certain period of time, because we've done sort of different tests, and you can check it, and you can check it up against the information that we know, right? And if it's way off, you know that there's been a mistake there. But once you get over around the 2 to 3,000 year mark at the most, usually it's closer to the 2,000 year mark, things start to go a little bit skew with. This is where we actually need a way of checking it against something. This is where we need to be able to calibrate these equations, and that's where stuff like this comes in really, really useful, because we know what date this is supposed to be. We know what date it's supposed to be, not from the carbon-14 dating, but from the features, from the paint, from the style, and we have certifications from the British Museum telling us that that's what it is. Now, what we can actually go and do is take a sample of this, put it through a laboratory, do some tests on it, and see what the date actually comes back as. Because, John, I was talking to you about this. I've seen you've just come back here. I was talking to you about this. If we actually test this, what do we think it's going to be? Probably come out as quite a lot younger. Now, this has never been tested before simply because it hasn't need to be tested. According to the standard Egyptian chronology, which there are lots of problems with, by the way, but according to the standard Egyptian chronology, this has been dated to the third intermediate period, around 1,000 years BC. There's simply no need to carbon-14 date it because the features are perfect. But because of that, because it's been accepted by the archaeologists to be of a certain date, we can actually do legitimate carbon-14 testing and match it up. And it will give us a starting point to actually say, well, hang on a minute, there's something actually wrong here. We need to continue investigating and work out a way that we can calibrate these days to show that there is actually an issue here. But John, coming back to this point of let's have a look at how carbon-14 actually supports the Bible. Do you want to have a little comment about the accuracy of carbon-14 in terms of short-term history, as well as how things like these artifacts can be useful in helping fit all this picture together in the big sense?
Sure. My first experience with this was I was at Sydney University, and one of the profs there was sort of on side and sort of not on side, because he had a faith that the biblical record was useful, but not necessarily a faith that God made the world in just 6 days or anything like that, right? So his area of expertise was sort of Middle Eastern history. So I said, okay, now if you had a choice between a historic document and a carbon-14 date, what would you pick? He said, well, experience tells us pick the document every time, because we've actually got the document and we've got plenty of things around it. It's history, it's where it was found, all the things that back up what date you get even from the document. He said, so we'd pick the document every time. Experience tells us to do that. And I said, well, do you have any comments on carbon-14? He said, well, the surprising thing is the older you get a document based on carbon-14, the less reliable the carbon-14 date proves to be. Remember how Libby was trying to find verification for his carbon-14 method by matching it against documents? Well, he said he couldn't find any documents older than 4,000 to 5,000 years of age. So he's never, ever verified it, nor has anyone ever since. But what they find is when you have a document and it's, say, 2,000 years old, the carbon-14 date actually works fairly well. It's a short-term half-life, so it actually matches the age of stuff 2,000 years ago within reasonable accuracy. When you get to 2,500 years or 3,000 years ago, it's starting to actually part ways. And this professor was adamant that's exactly what you see. The older the document, the further away the carbon-14 date starts to go. Until you get to 4,000 years of age, all of a sudden you start to be thousands of years out. Now, remember when we had the seal under the water and its blood was 1,300 years dead while the actual seal was still alive? And you find the same is true for seashells. And they've discovered they have to add at least 1,300 years because of the carbon-14 seawater effect. The environment actually affects how the dating method works as well. So when it comes to carbon-14, the further back it goes, the less accurate it is. But the closer you get to the present, the biblical period of history, the more reliable it comes. And so this professor said, you know, if you want to deal with 2,000 years ago, 2,500, he said they pretty well closely match up.
Great stuff, John. Thank you very much. All All right, let's move on to some questions now. We've had a few questions come in, including a nice big long one that's just come in by email as well. So thank you very much for that. Let's run down and have a look at some of the questions. Keep the questions coming, of course. We've got sort of 20 minutes or so before we need to start rounding up and finishing off. First of all, more of a comment, but a very nice comment nonetheless from quite a way back. I'm not a well-educated man, but I can understand most of what CR team say and mean, even understanding what the world say. Well done, CR, and thanks. Thanks very much for that, Neil. We really do appreciate that. And I remember, John, you saying a while back, the truth is simple. So it shouldn't it shouldn't come across as something really, really complicated anyway. So,
well, Joseph, one of my aims has been, ever since I sort of worked my way through this dating stuff and geology stuff and all the assumptions, is that if I can write a document, and the one we've just put out for our newsletter on strata machines and that, if I can write a document that a kid in high school can understand, then the scientist should have no trouble whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right? So much of what we call academia is using big words and impossible grammar to disguise what you don't know. Right? And people say, oh, wow. And Diane, you've seen that happen as well in your field. And so what we try and do is actually make the simplicity of that which is true show up. Yes, that's true. Diane, you got any comments on your particular field?
Yes. If I always used to tell the students, you should be able to express this in plain language. And a useful way of learning something is to actually study it for yourself and then try and tell it to somebody else. And so I used to tell the students, try and teach this to somebody else who's not studying with you. And if you can't put it into plain language that they can understand, well, then you probably don't understand it. And as we said in one of our recent newsletter items about people's giving authority to scientists even when they say stuff that's just literally nonsense because it was generated by an algorithm that generated high sounding nonsense. Don't let anyone belt you over the head with a big word, and don't let anyone bluff you with balderdash. If you don't understand something, ask people, well, that's interesting. Say politely, that's interesting. Can you explain it a bit more? And if they can't, it's probably because they don't understand it themselves, or they are trying to bluff you.
Diane, you just mentioned that balderdash one. I remember that came out just a couple of weeks ago in our newsletter. So would you tell people, this is separately from these sort of programs, tell people how they can get our newsletter and what it's for, because there are many people out there, this may be the first time they've come across us, they would get great value from these short releases every week or two.
Yes, every few weeks we put out an email newsletter, so it'll just come out as an email that's free. And we look at what's reported in the various scientific news services, give a little summary of what was actually discovered, and then help you to understand it from a biblical point of view, because usually these discoveries are reported as this is some sort of evidence for evolution or for an old Earth or various other things related to that. And so we help people to understand what was actually discovered and how most of the time it's not evidence for evolution or an old Earth at all. In fact, it fits with biblical history. So we help people to understand that. You can sign up for that newsletter. It's just a free email newsletter on our main website. Go to our main website, creationresearch.net, and you'll see a link there for newsletters. And
it's free.
This year we've started making some little videos after the newsletter has been sent out, where Joseph and I just give a little bit more background and maybe some more illustrations that we can't do in a simply in a brief email newsletter. If you've missed out on that, don't worry. We've been doing it for about 20 years, I think, John. We have kept them all, and we do have an archive. It's called the Creation Fact File. You can find that. It's a separate website.
There it is,
and
up
so
there, yeah.
after each newsletter goes out, we will store them on this archive in their separate topics. So you don't need to know which newsletter it came out in. You can just do a normal keyword search, look for whatever you're interested in, and you'll find these all stored there as separate items. So do have a look at that, the creation fact file.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Diane. Let's move on to some more questions. We'll just see what we've got in the chat, and then we'll use the email question, and then we'll sort of do a few comments to conclude and wrap up before we finish in sort of 20 minutes time or so. Here's a sort of a comment question from Neil, and maybe some comments from you and John or Diane. The Bible is the only religious book that has times, dates, and places. The Bible is full of them, as if to say, check me and see. I think that's a really important point. The first one that really springs to mind, John, is the diary that Noah kept. It really is a diary. It's not a once upon a time this happened. It's, you know, a very specific to a date and time.
The one that I always love is sort of the start of Luke's gospel in the book of Acts, where he basically says, "Oh, my friend Theophilus, I've gone to all the trouble to gather all the eyewitness accounts." And when you read through this, it sort of says on this day at this place in this town. And the advantage of people like Luke is, A, he wasn't a Jew, he was a Greek. So in that sense, he's independent, unbiased. And he grew up and became a doctor. So he's well trained in sort of collecting the facts of the day. And he sorted it out. And he even used terms that people got to say, that couldn't possibly be true. And then when we've dug up enough of that city that was named, it turns out to be absolutely true. So Luke knew better history than all of the people in modern archaeology, and they've been forced to bow to the accuracy of the times, dates, and the places. Old Testament, New Testament, God's check is, come and check me and see. Try me, test me, prove me today, says the Lord. And if you don't know this God as your Savior, then do it today. Test him, try and prove me. And you'll find he really is the only true God and Lord and Savior.
Great stuff. All right, another question from Keith. Here it is. What's the explanation when these carbon-14 people are asked why they are off by 1,300 years?
Basically, you will see that when carbon-14 has to get into water, it first of all had to form in the air. So you've got high energy radiation coming in, hits nitrogen. The nitrogen produces carbon-14. And so you've gone from a big percentage of nitrogen to a small percentage of carbon-14. That then is a very voracious atom, and it will react very quickly with oxygen to form radioactive carbon dioxide. Then that then gets to dissolve in rainwater, right? And it will go down into the ocean and some onto the land. Now, once it gets into the ocean, you can imagine X number of particles of nitrogen, Y carbon-14, and Z a much tinier number of carbon-14. And then when it gets into the ocean, all of a sudden it's dispersed. The oxygen, the animals in the sea are not directly breathing the atmosphere where your main store of carbon-14 is. So there's now a huge a diffusion, a huge dilution, and so you end up behind the 8 ball. It takes you a long time to catch up on the amount of carbon-14 that's normally used as the ratio on land. So that's those people who know. To be honest, most people who even refer to carbon-14 dates don't realize that you can have living dead things who died according to carbon-14 dating 1,300 years ago, and they're still right around living in your backyard.
Yeah, indeed. All right, quick question from George, which has got a very simple explanation. What happened to Super Chat, George? We have been blocked from monetization by YouTube. We do think we have a solution, and so hopefully, Lord willing, next week it will be there. So pray much for that we get a solution, because it was great getting a little bit of support from this. But you can still support us, and we still need your support. So you will see in the description down below, there are different ways to donate through PayPal or through our Creation Research Centre website securely, and so on and so forth. Go and check that out. We really do appreciate all of your support, so thank you very, very much for that. Let's scroll down and have a little bit of a look. Here is a question from Jerome. Does radiation also cause your metabolism to slow down? Question there for Diane, perhaps?
Well, yeah. In terms of just damaging your cell, yes, damaging your cells. So the repair processes of your normal tissue turnover, because we are actually making new cells all the time. And if the DNA is damaged there, you can't make them as quickly. So that's you slow down. In terms of your metabolism, that's actually a chemical process in terms of how fast you process the food you eat and the air you breathe and things like that. So it probably doesn't do that, but it does make you sick in other ways.
Diane, you're our most recent victim of radiation damage here in Australia, where us European white-skinned descendants of Japheth suffer notoriously. So what happened to you recently, just as a personal example?
I had to have a skin cancer removed from the side of my face. Now in Australia, that's a very, very common problem, because we live in an area of high radiation, but not from radioactive radiation. It's ultraviolet radiation, but that also has the same effect on your cells if you get enough of it. It damages your DNA, and damaged DNA is one of the causes of cancer. And so that's why people who are exposed to radiation have an increased rate of getting cancer. But yes, there are other forms of radiation that will have the same problem. And yes, I did suffer from that personally, and I've known other people who have had the same problem as well, just from people who live around me or people I've known in my family. So it's a common problem here, because we live in a place where there's a lot of ultraviolet radiation. So there are other forms of radiation that will damage our cells. And that is a good reminder to think of in terms of the biblical history of the world. That graph I showed you with the long ages, those records are real, just like the records of when things happened. So if we need to take those seriously and think, all right, what was the world like? What were we told that the world was like? Yes, it was very good. So things like radiation and other hazardous things weren't there to start with. The world has definitely changed, but it hasn't evolved. It's gone downhill. And the skin cancer I experienced is a good example of how the world has gone downhill and how individuals have gone downhill.
Great stuff. Thanks for that, Diane. John, here's something to perhaps comment on from George Bond. And I know this is a decay, talking about the decay rate versus the, how much is being produced. I know that's a problem with radioactive dating, with I think it's potassium to argon with the helium that's produced. But anyway, maybe a brief comment on this. More carbon-14 is made than decays, hence the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio can't be constant, and the carbon-14 dates are unreliable the older the item is. So any comments or anything like that about equilibrium and stuff like that?
Okay. I guess this is a pretty good place to go back to my slides here for a few moments.
Sure.
Because of all the stuff that we're doing today, most of it is simple, but this part here, because it involves maths, it's like when Jesus told the disciples they'd have to forgive 70 times 7. One of the disciples probably thought, oh no, repentance is one thing, mathematics is something else. This is the hardest part of the whole issue, but a very vital part. How long does it take carbon-14 in the atmosphere to reach equilibrium, starting from carbon-14 zero? And you say, why would you even ask the question? Well, you've got to realize, all you evolutionists out there, that your theory says originally there was no carbon. You don't even have hydrogen. So you come from nothing, by no reason, for no purpose, by no mechanism known, from nothing to something. So please don't criticize Christians for believing God made everything but starting with nothing. He just used intelligence, whereas you're using no intelligence at all. And you are getting carbon somehow, and then you are turning that into radioactive carbon after the carbon has evolved into nitrogen. Okay, now I put this question to Dr. Tom Hayward, who earned his living at the Los Alamos project. And I simply asked, Tom, can you understand, can you explain to me, please, so I can re-explain to other, that if the present rates of formation and decay are consistent through time, then how do you end up with carbon-14 in the balance that it is in the atmosphere? Now, he sat down, did some calculations, came back to me, and he came back with that graph. You see, I put his name on it. I don't take credit for things like this. I did maths at university, but I was much happier bashing rocks. Okay, so if you start with an atmosphere that has not got any carbon, then you can't have carbon-14 right from the start. So there must have been a time when you start with carbon-14 zero, bottom left-hand side of the graph. How long does it take the carbon to carbon-14 ratio to reach up to where it is at the moment? Enter right-hand side top. Okay, now when you have a look at this and you actually plot it up, Tom came back with the answer 30,000 years. Now that even caused him a problem because Tom was like me. You see, we wanted the whole issue of the age of the Earth, the age of carbon-14, just to go away. Age was so hard to deal with. The older I get, the harder I find it to deal with. But in reality, can you see a problem here? I'll show you what the problem is. If you take, right there, come on, move one. If it takes approximately 30,000 years for carbon-14 in the atmosphere to reach equilibrium, then where is it at the moment? If the measured rate shows it is not in equilibrium, where is it then? Well, you see, we know it's not at equilibrium. The rate at which it's forming is faster than the rate at which it's disappearing. So when you have a look at this whole situation, you will find the atmosphere, and I better go to the next one where you can actually see it. The atmosphere is less than 30,000 years old. Now, that stymied Tom, and it really stymied me, but I thought, well, if the atmosphere is less than 30,000 years old, then how can you have Aboriginal weapons that are more than 70,000 years old? You can't. So right at the bottom level, the imbalance of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere tells you that we are living in a young atmosphere. How long would it take for the atmosphere to reach the current ratio of carbon-14 formation? Are you ready for a bit of a shock? Because Tom is one of these guys who's not only lived by making graphs go this way or that way, he's been blowing atoms up and seeing what they did, playing with sort of giant mini bombs all his life at the Los Alamos project while he's been there. Now, you don't need to understand the 18.8 atom grams per minute, lose, etc. The answer is, well, go to his graph. You see, I've lost half of you already, haven't I? That's how I used to feel when the maths lecturer sort of scribbled these things up and said, can you see it? Well, I can see it now because I've sat down and thought this through over and over again. If the rate at which it's forming is faster than the rate at which it's falling apart, then the Earth's atmosphere, well, look, there's all the data. There's the dotted lines. The oldest it could be possibly is 16,000 years, but it's more likely less than 13,000 years. That's assuming whatever it's doing today, it's always done. The Earth's atmosphere hasn't been here that long. Now, if you got lost, you're going to have to go through and think that over one more time. But what it does do is tell you two things. One is when Libby discovered the same thing. Yes, he knew all about this problem. There's his quote we started with. If one were to imagine that the cosmic radiation had been turned off, in other words, it wasn't there long ago, then the enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to reach equilibrium state could not have been manufactured. Living matter would be much less than the rate of production calculated from the neutron intensity. In other words, you are going to get the wrong dates from carbon-14, and all you needed to know was the actual ratio of how much formed versus how much decayed. Now, don't be surprised if you ask the real God who was there, who said he made the world in 6 days and he made it very good, then not even radioactive carbon, which is formed by high energy radiation bombarding the Earth to produce toxic gases. Yes, carbon-14 is toxic. You wear your mask in a laboratory to make sure you don't breathe it in. Then you'll find that you know what the reason is. The world was good at the start. Adam was not breathing in radioactive carbon. It was most probably still pretty good in the atmosphere right through to Noah's flood. Noah was not breathing in carbon-14. that his grandchildren were, and hence Diane's graph. Hence Libby's problem. Hey, it's almost as if the carbon-14 was turned off. Well, it was. Can I encourage you? Encourage Sam. Send him a congratulations. He's having a night off tonight because he's got another problem to solve. But that's what he brought up with us. And no, it didn't take 30,000 years. We could probably date that, even the ink on it, on a bit of paper. And you'd be surprised at the wrong dates you would often get. Carbon-14 is interesting. The closer you get to the present, the more it supports your biblical data. And the biblical data, of course, is accurate. Why? Because it's based on real history, the words of a witness who was there. Bring me back full screen, Joseph.
All right. Well, we're just starting to run out of time. So what we're going to do, we're going to do 3 questions in about 5 minutes, right? Because 2 of those questions are going to be very, very short, because we're only going to comment 1 or 2 little things, because we're going to deal with them at a later date. And remember that any questions we don't get to, we will bring up in the future, and we will deal with in the future as we go. Here's a question from Neil. John, this is the main one to answer. If you carbon date a piece of newly formed rock from a volcano, what age would you get, the eruption date or the pre-eruption date? Now, I can see, first off, we're dealing with 2 different types of dating here, right? Carbon requires an organic material. A rock from a volcano is a volcanic, it's not organic. So a very brief comment on that, on the difference perhaps, and a little mention about some of the, how it works in terms of eruption or pre-eruptions.
Okay, if we're talking about an igneous pipe, the ones that come up and we let them rot and we mine them for diamonds, you could do that. You could take the diamond and extract the carbon-14, and you'll find it's a lot older than the 3.2 billion years of age often attributed to these volcanic pipes. But if you talk about a modern volcano that comes out, unless it's come through limestone, pushed its way up through limestone, incorporate bits of limestone in it, and cook the limestone so the CO2 comes off, just like we do in concrete, you could not use the carbon-14 dating method on volcanic rock at all. So the question, an interesting one, only works if you're going to take diamonds out of volcanic rock, and then you'll find it ain't as old as people think, but the age is the date of the diamond, not the age of the eruption.
Yeah. Great comment there, John. All right, 2 very, very quick questions, because we're not actually going to go through them all, but I'm going to bring this up, John, and we'll ask you for a comment. This is a question which was emailed into us by Matt Mann from the Young Earth Creation channel. It's also associated with Standing for Truth, and that's why, okay, I'll just put it up on the screen there. It's not the best way, but it's a nice long question. Do you know how the layers after the flood built up so fast? If they did, for example, after the flood, we get volcanism, right? So that's the KT boundary. Then we have the arc landing and animals spreading out and dying. These layers, we find them in first are now called the Paleocene, followed by the Eocene, Miocene, all these lovely names. And above that, and even more until we get to the rock layer, which we're on today, which is currently regarded as the Pleistocene. So if the flood did make these upper layers all at the same time, well, how did fossils get in the deeper ones? If it did not make these layers, how were they formed so fast after the flood? Now, the reason I brought this up, and we're not going to deal with that because that is about a 10-hour presentation, and it goes back to this question of the post-flood boundary, flood boundary, all this kind of stuff, right? We had an email just a couple of days ago, both me and John, from Donnie over at Standing for Truth, and we're going to email him back probably tomorrow. I was supposed to do it today, so if he's watching, sorry, we have got your message. We're going to email you back tomorrow. It's just today's been very busy, and we want to try and schedule at least 2 presentations, in-depth presentations, featuring myself and featuring John, where we actually look at this whole issue of how layers form. We need to understand the history, we need to understand how they form in the real world, and we need to understand, can we even get a line to say this is flood, this is post-flood? Is it in the KT boundary, right? The tertiary Cretaceous boundary, or is it, as some other people say, much, 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 much higher than that? What's it all going on here? So, John, perhaps a very brief comment from you, and we'll deal with it more comprehensively, both on Creation Conversations and on Standing for Truth.
Well, I'll give you a teaser. I still remember when my university professor, world famous professor, expert in so-called continental drift, etc., he brought continental drift to Australia, made it convincible, so that before him, if you believed in continental drift and tried to get your PhD, you never did. It was out. But then when he came, it was in. So if you tried to get your PhD without believing continental drift, you were out again. So I learned another good lesson. Paradigms change with lecturers, not necessarily with the facts. The facts stayed exactly the same. But one of the things he said that got me intrigued in where are these boundaries is that he said the rocks in the Grand Canyon get old sideways. And then he said nothing more about it for years. I'm waiting for him to say anything, but he never said anything about it. He was one of those professors, by the way, that if you brought in a new fossil and he wanted to see it, he would ask, could he borrow it and take it away for research? Well, you never saw that fossil again. You know that experience, Joseph. Yeah, but
sometimes it's with you, John, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm trying to get my collection back again. So what you'll find is there's another professor involved that would be worthwhile reading before we do the session for Standing for Truth, and that's Professor Derek Ager, because he did one thing that we've done deliberately. He went all over the world looking at the actual layers and commenting on what the layers are actually like, not on the theory about them. So we'll be covering all of those. His name is Professor Derek Ager. He's currently dead, and you'll find that his books have been both popular and unpopular. Unpopular with the conservative geologists, because he says everything you believe is basically wrong. Everything you believe is the opposite of how the first geologists started. They were all creationists and they got it right. So we'll be actually talking about those things on the SFT program.
Great stuff. We're going to finish with one final comment, and it's more of a promotion. We've had a question here which says, what is some of the best archaeological evidence for the Exodus, barring basically archaeology in scripture and Exodus and all this kind of stuff? There's two fantastic resources which I left earlier to go and grab. The first one is, I grabbed the wrong one. This is actually by a guy called Dr. John Osgood, who's over there in Australia with you guys, John. A brilliant historian, and he's written some incredible stuff. This is actually called The Times of Abraham and the Philistines. It's a great book. I recommend you get it. But there's also another one which I didn't grab a second ago called The Egypt and the Exodus. Both of these are available all around the world. They're available here in the UK. Go and grab them. He deals with things like Exodus and the archaeological evidence. But if you want something a little bit more in depth, they're the sort of the layman style ones. We have two of them available in the UK. There's about 5 available now, I believe, John. But if you want a really in-depth look, they speak with one voice. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is absolutely fantastic. It's probably one of the most comprehensive chronological books that I've ever come across. It deals with the real evidence, it deals with archaeological evidence, and it deals with genetic evidence as well. Because many years ago, John wrote another brilliant book called Into All the World. It's, again, good. I recommend you get it. It's available from Creation Research, right? This is sort of part 2, and it deals with the genetic stuff in there as well that wasn't available at the time. But it's an extremely comprehensive look at the correlation of the biblical record with archaeology. I highly recommend it. It's groundbreaking work. At the moment, we don't have any copies in the UK to buy, but you can buy it internationally from Australia. I believe that's right, John. Correct me if not.
Yeah, we have all of John's books here in Australia.
Yeah. We will hopefully get more copies here in the UK, so it becomes a bit easier to send them out in the UK.
Well, you nearly did have them, Joseph.
I nearly did have some. I know.
Post office lost the entire shipment.
I don't know what happened with that. It completely went haywire.
Right at the start of COVID.
Yeah, we're looking at options of printing or getting them shipped here in the UK, but this is a must have if you're interested in chronology and archaeology and the Bible. It is honestly, it is groundbreaking stuff, and I highly recommend it personally. So there we go. There's a little comment for you there. So just about brings us up nicely, rounded up to the end. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. We've had a very lively chat, and like I say, no Sam, so I've tried to speak and check and come back, and it's all over the place. So I've not seen all of the comments, but thank you for everybody who commented. Thank you for everybody who interacted. Thank you for everybody who is going to go away and donate to us in advance. Remember, there's details of that down in the description below, because while we're not monetized at the moment, we're hopefully getting that solution sorted next week. But in the meantime, we greatly appreciate any donations, and I know we've already had some through, so thank you very much for that. God bless everybody. We will see you next week for another topic. John, Diane, any final comments from you?
No, don't get too old, or your carbon 14 date will work out.
Absolutely. All right. Well, God bless everybody. We will catch you next week.
Yes, goodbye.
Goodbye.